Greetings, lovely people, and welcome to Fast Track Thoughts. Today we're going to be talking about episode 5 of Moon Knight Asylum. So spoilers ahead for that episode, and let's just jump into it and roll that intro. So this episode very much picks up where we left off last episode with the asylum, or the medical hospital, or psychiatric ward, whatever you want to call it. And we're thrown into this idea that maybe the end of last episode was an illusion. The escape from the Doctor was an illusion in and of itself, a fantasy, something like that, which is really, really interesting. We then go on to have a full psychoanalysis sort of scene with Dr. Hera, which, yes, it's Hera or Hera or whatever, the main bad guy's name. I'm gonna call him Hera because I haven't been bothered to check the actual pronunciation yet, and it sounds close enough, so whatever. And yeah, essentially it's brought up that, like, oh yeah, the hippo was, a figment of imagination, a new character in the figment of the imagination of Mark. That, like, Stephen can be, like, expelled sort of thing, which is some sort of foreshadowing, but I'll get to that. But then, when Mark starts to fight back again, he's injected with some yummy drugs, and wakes up back where we left off last episode, with the screaming at the hippo, and the hippo tells them, I'm going to get to her actual name, but just roll with it, I'm doing it from notes. Hippo tells them they're dead, or they got shot, and that they are in the Duat, which is the Egyptian underworld. And obviously the hippo, being in the Egyptian underworld, is Taweret. I assume I'm saying it right, but I'm not completely sure. My Egyptian, lore is very bad, so I apologise if, anything like the Duat or Taweret or anything like that I'm saying wrong. It's just one of those things. But Taweret then goes on to say that the Duat is a afterlife, not the. And we actually get a direct mention of the ancestral plane, which of course is the Wakandan afterlife, which is very interesting, and she even talks about it as being this beautiful place, which, it is very much visualized that way. So that means that every potential underworld, afterlife, place where you go after death in the MCU does exist, potentially at least, and whatever religion or whatever thing you assign yourself to, that's where you go. So I suppose Valhalla must exist by that logic, which is very interesting. That's just a side note of my own thinking of just like, Valhalla must exist, which is very interesting. But yeah, as I say, they bring up that Hera is now Dr. Hera, because Mark goes on a little bit of a mental break of, this can't be real. I was literally just talking to Dr. Hera about all these fantasies and stuff, and Stephen calls him out on it of Doctor, specifically. But anyway, they are told that they need to balance the scales in order to pass through to the Field of Reeds, which is something from Egyptian mythology. Essentially, that's heaven, whereas the Duat is somewhere between hell and, I guess, purgatory would be one way of putting it. But in any case, we have to, watch them as they try and balance their scales. And they start that by going into... Well, actually, first off, we see something that I was so sure would be the third personality, like a memory of the third personality, because neither of them seemed to recognize it initially. Though that is explained later. It doesn't actually make sense that they would think like that. But yeah, the first major thing is that we go into a room full of the people Mark killed. And Mark remembers every single one. Not by name or anything, but he knows where it was. They killed every single person in that room. And then there's a child in that room. And it's not as bad as you would initially think from that. Stephen even has a line very similar to, like, wait, why is there a kid in the room of people you killed, sort of thing? Mark had a brother. And that is the crux of this episode, really. Mark had a brother when he was a child. Mark apparently was the original, and I'll get into a bit more of that a little bit later. Mark and his brother went to play around in the caves, and the caves flooded. His brother drowned, he survived. And his mother, at his brother's funeral, blamed him for it. Blamed him for his brother's death. So this leads to a lot of things around his mother being somewhat potentially mentally ill in some form. Either that or just so stricken with grief that she kind of becomes a shell, and later we find out kind of a monster in her own right. This leads to a bunch of things, including Mark leaving his parents, leaving his father, who he did seem to actually like, and his father did care for him. And he leaves, goes and lives his life, and, does all his mercenary things, all his military things. And that leads us to the point that we've already heard about, where he tried to save Layla's father, and himself was killed. And we see the full scene of Konju's deal, which once again, pretty sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but Konju, whatever, the moon deity's deal. And Konju actually calls Mark his Moon Knight. So Moon Knight isn't something like with a lot of the titles in the MCU where it's not really something that's ever used. Moon Knight is officially what Mark is in the suit, which is a really interesting element, I believe. So we then get launched back into the Balancing the Scales. Towerette uses Cyrus's gate to take them back, or is going to, that's the plan anyway. And they still need to balance the scales before they can actually get through that gate. Mark doesn't want to see what happened with his mother, though, because that's something that Mark dragged Stephen away from before they saw it. We then snap back to the hospital, because Mark has kind of been freaking out. They go back to the hospital with Dr. Hera, and something has changed, because he had a damaged nose previously, and apparently no time has passed really, maybe a few hours in the hospital, and yet his nose is fixed completely, no scarring, no damage, nothing. He's fine. And he even asks if he was sedated or anything like that, to which Dr. Hera says that that's not a thing, which is just, there's a lot happening in these scenes, and I'm not going to get fully into them, but it's very interesting stuff. Sorry, I'm going through my notes right now. We get a question of if Mark created Stephen, or Stephen created Mark. And it's a really interesting way, and I think from this episode we can pretty much take that Mark is the original that created Stephen. I'll get into that a bit more in a minute. In fact, literally next. So they go back into the fantastical world of the Duat, and find that after going and showing Stephen what happened with his mother beat Mark, we find that Stephen Grant is in fact a fantasy. The film that had the name Stephen Grant that we saw last episode was actually the basis for Stephen. Stephen is a figment of Mark's imagination, so to speak. Obviously it's an alternate personality, but Stephen Grant is not the original. Stephen Grant is a name taken from a film, and a coping mechanism for Mark, essentially being Stephen's purpose to ignore the worst parts of Mark's life. All the parts of Mark's life that he didn't want to experience, he gave to Stephen. And Stephen has, quote-unquote, no fear. Obviously, that's not really... It doesn't really apply generally to Stephen, but that was Stephen's purpose. Stephen is a coping mechanism to live as perfect life as possible, ignoring all the worst aspects of it, in order to keep Mark safe, essentially mentally. And then we get the reveal that Mark's mother is dead. So when Stephen has been calling her, it hasn't been actually real. Or rather, he is calling her, but no one answers. No one's talking to him. Stephen then has a bit of a break and snaps to the hospital. Dr. Hera talks to Stephen as if they have spoke before, even though this is the first time we've seen Stephen and Dr. Hera interact. And Stephen ends up accepting his mother's death. And they go back to the duat, and we see that scene from earlier that I assumed initially would be the other altar, is instead Mark getting drunk outside of his mother's funeral, refusing to go in, but interacting with his father. So Stephen didn't, but Mark did go to the funeral of his mother. Even though Mark doesn't remember it, because Mark got drunk. And Stephen doesn't remember the things that Mark does. So neither actually remember going to the funeral. One was intoxicated, and the other was also probably intoxicated, but also doesn't experience the same things, and just assumed he'd wandered somewhere in his sleep. That being Stephen, just assumed he'd wandered somewhere in his sleep. So we go back to the duat, the scales don't balance, and we get some Egyptian zombies. Not mummies, different. And the duat zombies try and pull Mark into the duat, and Stephen, after witnessing Mark nearly get killed pretty quickly actually, decides to fight. And Stephen does a good job. He defeats multiple of the zombies, but unfortunately one of them manages to almost pull Mark over out of the boat that the duat is into the sands, which would kill them. And Stephen ends up sacrificing himself to the duat to save Mark. And as Stephen dies, or is turned to stone, or turned to sand, or whatever happens, the scales balance, and Taweret basically just decides to send Mark to the field of reeds. And that's where we end. Mark is in Egyptian heaven, essentially. Stephen is, for all intents and purposes, dead. And we still don't know who that third altar is. The one that was in the sarcophagus last episode and hasn't been brought up still. We can only assume that altar is there somewhere. We just haven't quite seen him. But that is the episode, and it's a lot to unpack. Honestly, it's a lot. And I don't think I necessarily have as much to say about this episode as I did last episode, other than the fact that obviously I made notes on this one, so it was a little bit more concisive. But it was a very interesting episode. The idea that they're still playing with the, is this all imaginary? You know, is this all in the head of someone with multiple personality? I can't remember. I'm gonna have to write down what what the actual term for it is. Is it DID? It's DID. Yeah, I'm gonna have to write that down at some point. But yeah, is this all in the head of a DID patient? Like, is that what this is? You know, is the hospital actually real, or is this truly the duat with some coping mechanisms coming into place that because of the DID? Because I think regardless of everything, you know, Mark, Stephen, the other character, they are suffering from DID. They definitely are, regardless of anything else. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for the reality to be the hospital, as weird as that hospital may be. I'm really interested in seeing where this goes, and I don't really have expectations of anything at this point. We apparently don't have Stephen anymore, which is interesting. Stephen has been sacrificed to the duat. There's still that other altar that we haven't met yet. The Hippo, the Taweret actress, is in another episode, I do believe. I think she's in next episode. So presumably we are going to return to the duat in some form or fashion. But yeah, it's all very interesting. The fact that Tauret does have the, choice, the opportunity, the ability to return Mark to Khonshu does probably mean we'll see that next episode. Probably with Tauret appearing in the Field of Reeds to talk to Mark and be like, I can still bring you back. Because at the end of the day, if he's brought back to the overworld, to, life, as he is without Khonshu, he just dies. Or rather, he'll just be in a dead body, conscious but not alive. He needs Khonshu. So I'm really interested in seeing how they actually fix that. I'm very interested to hear if Tauret was actually banished and just decided to pick up the job of, just piloting the boat on the Duat. But it's interesting. It's very interesting. But in any case, that's going to be it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like it, subscribe if you're new around here, and ring that bell so you never miss an upload. Otherwise, tell me what you think of the episode in the comments below. I'm really interested in hearing what you think. And, yeah, hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye!